Exactement, vous avez raison. Oui. Pour nous, c'est pas un progrès.
No.
Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in our meeting today. Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 38 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. Just a reminder that all comments should be addressed to the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, March 9th, 2026, the committee resumed its study of the federal spending power. I would like to welcome our witnesses. All virtual witnesses have conducted a mandatory witness onboarding test. You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will open the floor to questions. And that's it. Okay. And so we'll start with, as an individual, Daniel Belland. Go ahead, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for your invitation. Bonjour, je vous remercie de...
Good morning, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my views on the federal spending power. The federal spending power is not explicitly enshrined in the Constitution, and efforts to regulate it under the Meech, Lake, and Charlottetown Accords were never implemented due to the failure of those agreements. In this context, it is Parliament, including your committee, that must strive to regulate this power.
A large-scale use of the federal spending power that, as the late Tom Kent once remarked, is now featured in our written Constitution. As stated in Section 36(2) of the Constitution Act 1982, Parliament and the Government of Canada are committed to the principle of making equalization payments to ensure that provincial governments have sufficient revenues to provide reasonably comparable levels of public services at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. Despite these constitutional embeddedness of the general principle of equalization, the concrete federal equalization program and the formula used to calculate payments to received by provinces that are entitled to benefits are an enduring source of controversy across the country in both receiving and non-receiving provinces. For example, in 2024, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador filed a lawsuit against the federal government based on the claim that the, quote, equalization program does not achieve its constitutional purpose, end of quote. British Columbia and Saskatchewan decided to intervene in that court case to express their grievances about the current equalization formula.
Whatever one may think of these developments, their very existence underscores that the debate over how the equalization program operates continues across Canada. Created in 1957, this program is inevitably controversial due to its complexity, which leaves plenty of scope for political manipulation. And there are some aspects of equalization. For example, approximately $27 billion in 26-27, and its explicitly redistributive nature. Only provinces with a fiscal capacity below the national average receive payments from the federal government. And of course, equalization is not the only federal transfer. There's also the Canada Health Transfer, which is much more substantial than equalization payments, and all the provinces receive some on a per capita basis.
Is also a necessary policy instrument to reduce horizontal fiscal inequality among provinces and help lesser-off provinces offer quality public services to their population without any strings attached. This unconditional nature of equalization payments is consistent with provincial autonomy while reinforcing social citizenship and fiscal solidarity across the country. Because equalization is both controversial and necessary, but also because of changing economic and fiscal circumstances, the equalization program must be reviewed on a regular basis. The current equalization formula was adopted during the early Harper years based on the recommendations of the 2006 report of the expert panel on equalization and territorial formula financing.
The time has come for the federal government to consider establishing a new group of experts on the equalization formula to evaluate it and also the effectiveness of the program, taking into account the current fiscal conditions while considering potential changes to the calculation of provincial fiscal capacity, as well as the possibility of taking into account provincial spending needs when calculating payments to recipient provinces, and even establishing a permanent independent commission tasked with advising the federal government on these issues. So, of course, I'll be able to go into greater depth during the question period later. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Ballon. Next, we have from the CD Howe, William Robson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I hope my remarks and answers to your questions will help your work. I do look forward to the questions and will do my best to answer any related to specific federal programs and recent developments. For an opening, I hope it will help to provide an overview that focuses on intergovernmental transfers over time and a bit of context for thinking about their appropriate size and structure in the future. If you do find my remarks helpful, please give credit to my C.D. Howe Institute colleague, Alexandre Laurin. He and I wrote a report on intergovernmental fiscal arrangements for the Institute in 2015. We got invited to update that paper for the Canadian Handbook of Public Administration in 2018 and for the OECD in 2020. And in the field of fiscal federalism, that's a greatest hits album. That paper surveys the history of federal spending that was directly or indirectly funding activity in areas of provincial jurisdiction. I'll summarize it in 4 points. One is that amounts spent and raised by different levels of government in Canada have never coincided. The federal government has always raised more, and provincial, territorial, and local governments less than required for their own programs. So transfers from the federal to other governments have been a feature of Canadian fiscal policy since Confederation. Second point, these transfers were initially modest. They grew as the role of governments in providing services and redistributing income grew. If you look at the Department of Finance's fiscal reference tables, they show federal cash transfers as recorded in the revenues of the provinces and territories at about $127 billion in the 2024-25 fiscal year. That is up enormously from a decade ago. But the federal government, of course, has been expanding quite rapidly in its spending since then. To put them in scale, the transfers shown in the fiscal reference tables would be about a quarter of the spending of the federal government and about 1/5 of the revenues of the recipient governments. Those figures do not capture everything relevant to a discussion of the federal spending power, but they indicate that we're talking big and influential amounts. Third, Canadians, and Professor Bellin just gave us a taste of this, have been prominent commentators on fiscal federalism. Canadian economists and historians and political scientists have provided many insights about how to allocate taxing and spending powers, how to design intergovernmental transfers. So this committee can draw on lots of Canadian expertise, as it is now doing, for theory about externalities and deficiencies of centralization of revenue and reconciling those with merits of subsidiarity and different preferences across the country. Fourth point, notwithstanding those theories, the specific changes in federal provincial transfers in Canada have been very much the products of particular circumstances. We've seen fiscal pressures in the 1930s on the provinces, then the Second World War, the federal government's debt problems in the 1990s. Political pressure, healthcare has been a major story since the 1960s, and differences in the enthusiasm of inhabitants of different provinces for federal encroachment on provincial jurisdiction. I do not know any insight from economists or historians or political scientists that dictate that the gap between revenue and spending at the federal and provincial levels should be as large as it now is, or that the transfers that bridge it should be structured as they now are. In the interest of time, I'll close with 2 thoughts about forces that may affect federal spending in areas of provincial jurisdiction in the future. First, we are probably transitioning from a period when fiscal policy felt unconstrained to a more constrained period. The pressure of rising healthcare demands on provincial budgets is unrelenting. The federal government is facing rising interest costs and huge defense commitments, while feeble productivity growth constrains its ability to raise taxes. Second, especially at a time of acute discontent in some provinces and regions, we should be conscious that different types of intergovernmental transfers can affect the efficiency, accountability, and sustainability of public finances and major programs. The federal and provincial governments have access to essentially the same tax bases, and I think it would be good for the federation if their revenue raising and spending powers of governments at each level were better aligned. Thank you again for your attention and for the invitation to be with you. I look forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Robson. Next, we have Robert Laplante. You have 5 minutes.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair, for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts on what I consider, based on the conclusions of many experts, something that constitutes the main engine of federal-provincial relations within the Canadian federalism. I will not repeat a number of the points that the previous speakers made, Mr. Bélan and Mr. Robson. I agree with them that not only is there an imbalance in the means that can be mobilized by the Canadian government and those of the provinces, but also that this imbalance has given rise, since the adoption of the British North America Act, has led to definite confusion. And this confusion has had a major impact not only on the lives of the parties, but on the overall governance of the Canadian state, to the extent that over the decades, the various arrangements for the means of reestablishing or attempting to reestablish a certain degree of balance in the distribution of the means has contributed throughout all that time to a confusion in terms of the priorities. And this confusion of priorities has had a major impact on the operation of the state, in that its departments from across the various transformations of the government apparatus and the different parties in government, the government departments have become the receptacles, in a sense, of these conflicts of priorities. And the program design over the years has been particularly shaped by the various arrangements that have had to be found in order to make things operate. And this competition between end purposes results in program design ending up also as forming part of the political debate on the issues connected with not only the contradictions that can arise between the priorities of one level of government versus another, but also as regards what we could call the optimum use of public resources. If we consider the overall volume of tax collected, it is clear that not only is the imbalance of the incoming funds, but also the accumulation of tension, the buildup of tension based on the assignment of priorities, results in the fact that nowhere in the system is there an overall mechanism of optimization in the use of the resources. Equalization payments is perhaps in its most recent version one step in that direction, but other means of distribution of revenues results in the fact that there's always the beginnings of a fiscal imbalance that continues to grow. The different governments gradually, depending on their political platform, will attempt to reduce that expansion or try to enlarge it to the extent that there may be a position on the construction of the state in the federal system, and this disparity in the means always gives rise to an advantage for the central government, and this contributes inevitably to a tension toward greater centralization, as well as, I would say, a continuing ongoing discussion with the provinces that often complain that the possibilities for the federal government to spend in various formulae imposes on them obligations for which they don't have very much influence, and their taxpayers don't necessarily have an opportunity to express themselves on it.
So we'll open up the first round of questionings for 6 minutes. We'll start with Mr. Kelly.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair. Not sure who to start with. I think I'll start with Mr. Robson. We heard from all witnesses talk of distribution of revenue and outflows and inflows, this kind of thing. But I think any discussion of equalization, which all witnesses touched on, ought to start with some clarity and understanding that this is really about one province's far outsized contribution financially to the equalization system, to the ability of the federal government to spread money throughout the country, and that's Alberta. The outflow, the net is, there are various studies and statistics out there on the order of $600 billion over the decades. Yes, there are other provinces that have contributed net outward to equalization. Saskatchewan currently does. British Columbia, Ontario used to. But the Federation, we're now in a situation where the province with the nearly 40% of the population is a net recipient of equalization. So to what extent, when we talk about equalization, are we really talking about Alberta funding the other provinces?
It's in the nature of any equalization program that the provinces that have greater fiscal capacity will transfer some of their resources to the provinces with less fiscal capacity. So Alberta, and to Alberta's credit, will probably continue under whatever system we adopt to be a net contributor in a way that many other provinces will not. Having said that, though, I do want to underline a point that's already been made by my fellow presenters, that the formal equalization program is not necessarily the way we need to give expression to what Section 36 of the Constitution says. In fact, you could do, I think, a very good job of equalizing resources among the provinces if the federal government were to collect with the taxes that it deploys that are sensitive to income and redistribute on a per capita basis, an equal per capita basis. Something of that sort happens with the Canada Health and Social transfers. But there are strings attached, particularly in the health transfer, and the equalization program ought not to have such strings attached. So I know that's a very different system I'm describing from what we now have. But when you look at how the equalization program, the formal equalization program has changed over time, with various caps related to overall GDP, with certain provisions put in place to make sure that certain provinces did not become equalization recipients when otherwise the formula would have made them eligible. I think it's fair to say that this program is not very fit for purpose. And I'll just go back to repeating what I said earlier. There is nothing in the logic of intergovernmental transfers, theories of federalism, that dictates we should have the current setup. And so I think the equalization program is due for a revamp, and it could be to the advantage both of the contributing provinces, but also some of the recipient provinces, because there is a bit of a welfare wall kind of clawback, as I'm sure members of this group know, that when provinces take steps to increase their own revenues, they get penalized by the program. And I think it would be worth looking at formulas that would not have that effect.
Can I add something?
Quickly, I wanted to follow up a couple of his points very quickly.
Yeah. So I used to teach at the University of Calgary. I live in Alberta for almost 7 years, and I've studied Alberta politics, and many people in Alberta, they support the general principle of equalization. And, you know, all Canadians contribute to, all taxpayers contribute to equalization.
Thank you.
Even, you know, but the thing is that I think Albertans want the system to be fair and transparent, and I think that's where the issue is. It's not the principle of equalization per se. And I think there is possibility to have a real dialogue about how we can improve equalization in a way that.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in and move on with my questions,
Yes.
but that is a great point. I can agree with that point, that Albertans are generous and they do not object. They understand that the great wealth that we have from the resources that we extract ethically, sensibly, responsibly. It's not that Albertans are opposed to sharing. What they are opposed to is a federal government that passes laws that penalize Alberta for its resources and prevent Albertans from extracting their resources. We didn't hear on doorsteps people complaining about equalization during the previous government when the laws were not harming our industry. I heard many complaints about equalization on every one of my campaigns. I can assure you this is a doorstep issue with voters in Alberta. But I don't know if I've got time for a follow-up question with Mr. Robson, but
that's time.
All right, thank you.
Okay, next we have Mr. Littau for 6 minutes.
Bonjour, messieurs.
Good morning, gentlemen, and thank you for being here. Mr. Bella, we could begin with you. Indeed. First of all, I'll begin by saying that the equalization program is a transfer program of federal revenues. It's not provincial revenues that are distributed. It's the federal rather than provincial revenues that are transferred. And thus, in a province where revenues of citizens are higher than the average, of course, federal revenues will flow from that province in a large quantity. But, Mr. Ballet, if you could continue on the equalization program, it's true that it changes sometimes in ways that are difficult to understand. I was connected with one of those negotiations in 2016-17, and indeed it can be quite opaque in that process. But perhaps you could go into greater depth on continuing with what you were saying on how we could make that program a little bit more appropriate to the 21st century. Absolutely. Thank you for your question. I think that the aspect of governance that is often discussed less than the more technical aspects of the equalization program that is opaque, and most of the Canadians do not really understand how the formula works. And that's normal because it is complex. But the governance of equalization, first of all, I'd like to put forward the idea that we ought to have a new expert panel as we had in 2005 with Paul Martin, who appointed 5 individuals to this expert panel chaired by Al O'Brien, an economist from Alberta, and there were 4 other members, and they focused on equalization. And they submitted a report in 2006, which was to a large extent implemented by Stephen Harper, a conservative. And I think we ought to go through a similar exercise, but with a broader mandate. I think what Mr. Robson said is quite important. The equalization program, the important thing is not the program itself, but the principle. We're talking about a vertical imbalance when we talk about fiscal imbalance, but also a horizontal imbalance. In other words, inequalities between the provinces, which are to a large extent, as was mentioned earlier, having to do with the distribution of natural resources across the country. So the first thing to be done, I think, is to try to say, we're going to look at all the options. How can we do equalization, but perhaps not with the current program or formula? In other words, open up things, and it's often risky politically. There's always a risk attached to that. That's why the federal government, let's say over the past 20 years, has not wanted to change the equalization formula again. But we could ask those experts or economists, perhaps former public servants, public officials, about the horizontal imbalance, but also in connection with the vertical imbalance, to try to see how we could adopt a system that is more transparent. And we talked earlier, I mentioned that, about the idea of not only taking into account the fiscal capacity of the provinces, but also the potential cost of the services provided in the provinces, taking into account factors such as demographic aging and the population density, among other factors. And that's what is done in countries such as Australia. So are things that can be done in the area of equalization. I know you want to continue. I'll end there, but I could say a lot more, or I could send you documents about it as well. Yes, I would appreciate that a great deal. Our time is a little short, so
I'm sorry. Maybe in the next round we'll have time to discuss with you. But what do you think of Mr. Béland's idea of creating an independent commission or an independent group to manage equalization?
I think there's a lot of merit to that. It's been successful in the past. I would like to see a mandate for such a group include a mandate for simplification. I used to teach equalization to a public finance class. I'm glad I do not anymore. It has gotten very much harder to explain what is going on with that program. And I'll simply say again, and you're a former finance minister, so you know this, but just to underline the point, if you tax according to ability to provide revenue, and then you distribute equal per capita, and maybe you could have an extra amount for the population over age 65 or over age 70. That's something I've written on in the past also. I think that makes sense, but make it simple. It can't be so complicated that people distrust it, and it can't be so complicated that there's a lot of gamesmanship going on in playing the system in order to get a little bit more for your province, because that's effort wasted that could be put to much better use.
Thank you. And just in finishing, I want to thank you for all your work at the City Hall. I think you've now moved on to well, you're still there, but you moved on to another role. But I want to thank you for the good work you did there. Thank you.
And you, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Littell. Next, we have for 6 minutes, Mr. Garand.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I wish to thank our witnesses. As you know, we always thank the witnesses for being with us at the committee, but it's our second meeting on the spending power. And in the last meeting, none of the witnesses knew what the spending power is. And that's true of some of the MPs across the way. So I'm very happy to deal with the subject, and I'm going to start with Mr. Laplante. There is a fiscal imbalance, a vertical one. So the federal government has more revenues than what it needs for its current spending and its strict constitutional responsibilities. And the province is the reverse. Some deny the existence of a vertical fiscal imbalance, saying that anyway, if the Quebecers are short of money, the Quebec government just has to increase its taxes. What do you think about that? Is that a negationist discourse, or is that imbalance a real institutional problem in the current structure? There's no doubt in my mind that it is a real problem. Quebec has had a number of investigative reports on the subject, including the famous Commission on the Fiscal Imbalance, which was held in the late 90s, early 2000s, chaired by Mr. Séguin, who did a remarkable job. So this imbalance must be considered from two viewpoints. If we want to talk about governance, there's a technical side where one can indeed calculate the modes of distribution of funding by using the per capita basis or the age pyramid or one can use a number of parameters. Yes, but in a general way, because our time is limited. But do you agree in general that this fiscal imbalance exists, or that we can't just raise our taxes 10% without causing damage to the economy? That's evident. And on the debate of increasing taxes or not, there is a discussion on the end purpose. We can raise resources, but for what purpose? I'll come back to that. Because I had brought out the famous quote in 1996 from the chair of the Liberal Treasury Board, Marcel Massé, when Ottawa, in the fight against the deficit, grouped together the transfers and they created the CHTST. We don't like those acronyms, and it kind of caused the Quebec government to end. There was this change in the health system with the outpatient approach, and the chair of the Treasury Board said that we'll demonstrate that we have the means to protect future social programs, and there's a bit of it that's editorial, but it's accurate of what the president of the Treasury Board said. Mr. Laplante, do you think that the federal government is using its spending power to interfere in the political life of the provinces? And from a democratic viewpoint, what is the issue? A voter that doesn't receive adequate health services, how can they punish them at the election? In connection with these various redistribution formulas, there's a true democratic deficit. When we talk about opacity, when we talk about how difficult it is for citizens to understand how the sharing operates, clearly then they have a hard time in drawing the appropriate conclusions on the desirable effects or improper effects of that sharing. So the federal government, in its choices, could not take into account arbitration of one or more provinces among them, and could set up programs, the purposes of which are not even subject to debate within the provinces. And in the case of Quebec, this frequently occurs. This situation comes up, and we've seen that when programs were created for early childhood. We see that on dental health programs. We'll come back to the list because it can be a long list, but you anticipated my comments, but there are two ways of approaching this vertical imbalance, or a number of ways of dealing with it in two major categories: to make the multiplication of agreements systematic for conditional financing by Ottawa. Ottawa says to the provinces, we don't want to legislate, but you won't get the money if you don't do it the way we say. And then in the course of time, they've systematized and upgraded the payment of transfers with no strings attached. The Canada Health Transfer is not without strings attached, but it's not as bad as a number of the other new programs that have been brought in. So in what direction do you think the federal government has been going over the last several years between those two approaches? And is this a problem or a solution? Well, I think that the federal government has been acting more and more unilaterally. It can show interest in some observable initiatives in one or another province, but once they draw their conclusions, they are not too careful of having dialogue on it. If there was a group of experts or an expert panel, which was referred to earlier, then the expert panel ought to have a mandate to examine the impacts of the sharing formula on governance. This is very important.
Ms. Cabina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are for Mr. Robson. Mr. Robson, I'm sure you know the government has announced a sovereign wealth fund, which will be funded through the issuance of debt, and it actually invites the public to also invest in this fund. And we know that the government has a history of rough investment decisions. For the benefit of the Canadian public, could you explain what generally happens to investors when investments go bad in a fund like that, and particularly when investors have borrowed money?
I have concerns about what the federal government is doing with its balance sheet generally, and the Sovereign Wealth Fund would be one more log on that fire, if that's a metaphor people will accept. The federal government is borrowing new money at, if you look again at the fiscal reference tables, you'll see that the average interest rate on their debt is about 3% now. The return on investments that they are getting on their financial assets is lower than that. So on the face of it, right now, the federal government is borrowing and paying interest at a higher rate than the returns on the investments that it is making. I am concerned that the same thing will happen with the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I do not like to see the federal government's gross debt going up the way that it is because it's creating exposure. We see it in the interest payments, but also there are things going on, I think, with these investments and transfers that really ought to show in spending as opposed to the appearance of the federal government building up assets. So I would like to see the federal government do less of that.
And of course, we have seen spending by governments in the past, similar spending, such as in the 90s. Can you describe to the committee what happened to Canadians' quality of life when this experiment was tried last time?
Well, the federal government has certain types of financial assets, investments in certain crown corporations, such as the Bank of Canada, that are quite appropriate to the machinery of government. But I do not think that the public sector has a very good track record of making financial investments. This is not the same as investing in hard infrastructure of the kind, ports, airports, and so on, that governments can uniquely undertake. Perhaps it's time to unload some of those assets, but those are the types of investments that I think people usually have in mind when they think about things that the public sector is uniquely able to do. I do worry, like other people, that when you have investment funds with unclear mandates, a sort of a mixture of financial return, nation building, whatever else, regional development, that type of thing, that you're going to end up making decisions that are not economically guided. So, as I say, I worry about the expansion of the federal government's balance sheet. I would worry about that if it were occurring at the provincial level as well. And I think it makes the public finances more risky and more opaque than they would otherwise be.
And earlier this year, you authored an article titled "Ottawa's Fiscal Guardrail is Driving Us Toward the Cliff." Can you explain to the committee the essence of the article and why you titled it that?
Well, I admit that the guardrail terminology was a bit of a hook. We had that terminology come and go earlier in this decade. And it inspired a bit of ridicule at the time because it didn't appear that guardrails were really any kind of effective constraint against the government doing what it wanted to do kind of on a year-by-year or every 6-month basis. What the latest fiscal update seems to confirm is that the federal government, when it gets an extra revenue dollar beyond what it was expecting in its fiscal projections, it immediately increases spending. And the difficulty with increasing spending is that when you do it this year, the program that you increased is likely to develop a constituency, and the spending will continue in years to come. If your fiscal rule, the implicit fiscal rule, is that you will spend every revenue dollar, then we are not going to get to a situation where the budget is balanced, and we are not going to get to a situation where the federal government's debt is declining as a share of GDP, which they have said in the past they would like to do. So I think that the behavior we're seeing is not consistent with prudent fiscal policy.
And of course, this is timely because we are seeing that the Liberal government has abandoned its fiscal guardrails in its entirety. So can you explain the significance of this abandonment and describe what must be done to return fiscal sanity to the country's budget?
That's time. You'll have time to answer in the next round. Next, we have Mr. Sawatsky for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today. Professor Belons, I have a few questions for you. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. Much of the discussion around fiscal policy focuses on the total amount of government spending. The recent budgets in 2025 emphasize not just the level of spending, but also the quantity and quality of that spending. So, in your view, how important is it to distinguish between the quantity of federal spending and the quality of or effectiveness of that spending when evaluating fiscal policy?
Yeah, it depends how you define quality, and it's I think that the experts will not necessarily agree on what how to define quality. But when we talk about emphasizing the importance of, say, investing in the economic future of the country, I think that this is good idea to emphasize forms of spending that go in that direction. But the proof is in the pudding, and sometimes we can define something as an investment, but we don't know yet whether it will be good in the end, that this investment will actually generate returns the way the government might anticipate. And so I think that what's important is not just to look at the budget, but to monitor over time how these investments are actually working on the ground, and whether 3, 5 years, 10 years along the road further into the future, whether they have worked or not. So it's not just about the budget itself. We should evaluate the effectiveness of the measures and the investments we make over time in a systematic way. And we don't always do that.
Thank you. And would you consider investments in areas like skills training, housing supply, or productivity super deductions as examples of spending that can strengthen the economy and improve fiscal outcomes over time?
They might. Again, the devil is in the detail too. It's not just about what's in the budget. It's about how these measures are implemented. That's why implementation is really crucial, and it's something that needs to be monitored in a systematic way. And then we can, because budgets are incremental in nature, and they change, but there is quite a bit of continuity over time from year to year. But if we want to be more effective in terms of our own investments, we need to report back to Canadians how these investments have fared and exactly measure their impact over time, if we want to, say, continue that direction or invest in different ways. So I think here the proof is in the pudding, and we need to measure that pudding over time.
Thank you. So another question here. A recent analysis from the International Monetary Fund has indicated that Canada remains in a relatively strong position as compared to G7 partners, particularly in terms of debt sustainability and fiscal capacity. So how significant is it that an independent institution like the IMF continues to assess Canada as being one of the stronger fiscal positions among its peers?
Look, I think that when people have, there is sometimes doomsday discourse about the fiscal position of Canada, we are in a much better position now than we were, say, in the mid-1990s, early mid-1990s, right? I think one of your colleagues mentioned earlier what happened in 1995, 1996. So we are in a different position. We are in a stronger position, but things can change really rapidly in terms of the economy. We know all the uncertainty regarding the trade war in the United States and other things. So I think we have to be prudent about our forecast, of course, and the way we manage both expenditures and revenue raising. And I think it's important to understand too, and to emphasize that controlling spending, of course, is important, but we also have to think about the revenue side, right? And now to maybe review some tax expenditures that might be regressive and not that necessarily that helpful. And that's a form of spending, and directly a tax expenditure, tax credits that might not be so useful, and from a broader standpoint, and also think about how we can generate more revenue. So not just focus on controlling spending, but also on increasing revenue. There's a former U.S. Supreme Court justice who said taxes are the price we pay for civilized society. Of course, today's civilized society may sound a bit outdated as a language, but we have also to understand that taxation, including progressive taxation, is an important part of the mix.
Thank you. That's time. Next for 2.5 minutes, we have Mr. Garand.
Monsieur le Président, ça va être...
Thank you, Chair. It will be pleasant to return to the subject of today's study. Mr. Laplante I have the impression that in Canadian history, as a general rule, the federal government has taken advantage of crises, whether voluntarily or not, to centralizing with the agreement of the provinces on unemployment insurance at one time, policies on natural resources with the National Energy Program at one point. They've centralized or imposed more conditions in the 1990s. New programs have been imposed, giving the federal government power to spend during the pandemic. And here we see once again the tariff crisis, and the federal government is stepping in labor training, all very carefully, with taking the necessary steps to work it out. But as a general rule, have crises lean things towards centralization. And after the crisis, has the federal government tended back toward its natural position or kept those things in place? Not only have crises favored centralization and an increase or broadening of the role of the federal government, but they have also locked in decade after decade these initiatives. What do you mean by locked in? Well, what I mean is that the interventions done on behalf of or based on an emergency or on account of the need to find a short-term solution to problems, well, they tend to get set in. And we'll see that now right in front of us with Bill C-5, the act that is going to give the federal government freedom to step in and intervene in building infrastructure, to change the way different regulations apply on the environment and on impact assessment studies and so on. So each time, the arguments that are raised connected with an emergency are in reality instruments used to have the federal government achieve a certain purpose. Thank you.
Mr. McLean for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think my first question is going to be to Mr. Robson. When you talk about fiscal capacity, Alberta's been a recipient of the Federal Equalization Program once in 1964, over 60 years ago. And since that time, over $600 billion in fiscal transfers have occurred between Alberta and the rest of the country. $600 billion over about 60 years, including in periods when Alberta was suffering much worse than the rest of the country as far as unemployment goes, as far as the deficits they were incurring to deliver services to their citizens. And yet the transfer funds never ceased going from Alberta to the rest of the country. Do you consider that a fair equalization system when even one of the suffering provinces doesn't get money back to serve their citizens in their social services?
Because I've commented on the equalization program explicitly already, perhaps I could address some of the other ways in which some of the other programs on which Alberta would be on the negative side of the ledger. I can understand the logic of provinces that receive the Canada Health Transfer and therefore have more money to spend on healthcare than they would have if they were relying only on their own resources, and are therefore willing to accept the federal government's limitations on how they can run their healthcare system, even when the federal government is requiring them to do things that their population would prefer them not to do. It's a lot harder to understand the logic of a province that is a net loser from a system like that, which is being made both simultaneously poorer as a result of the net transfers going out of the province and also having the federal government tell them how they can and cannot run their healthcare system. So one of the things that I think would be very helpful for us as we think about fiscal federalism is to look at the ways in which the federal government is using its spending power to distort provincial priorities. I think we can logically separate those two things from the net flows of funds. I don't quarrel with what you said about the net flows out of Alberta, But I think it makes sense to look particularly at the programs where, as I say, the federal government is taking money away from a province on a net basis and simultaneously constraining its policy choices in ways that it would not like to do. I understand getting paid.
Thank you, Mr. Robson. Thank you. We've got limited time, but I appreciate your response. Let me move to Mr. Ballon here, because Mr. Ballon, you did talk about the system, and I appreciate the time you spent in Alberta and understanding what people are looking for there. You say that people, Albertans in particular, would like the system to be fair and transparent, and many Albertans feel it is not right now. They feel it needs to change so that we can actually see what are the inputs and what are the outputs, what determines how the transfers happen between the provinces. Can you give us some examples about how that could be better done, how it's failing Canadians right now, and how it could be more transparent and more fair?
So I've been writing about that for a long time with my colleague André Lecourt from University of Ottawa, and I can send you some documents about this. I think a permanent arm's length commission that will make recommendations about equalization payments to Parliament on a regular basis, something that they do in other countries like in Australia, and they will report every year on how they calculate, of course, equalization payments, the choices they make. And between these reports, they will go all across the country and consult with provinces about their fiscal needs and their perspectives, and also with business groups and other civil society actors. And I think that will
sorry,
be
Mr.
more
Ballon, I have to
transparent
interrupt
process.
because you're actually not getting to the specifics we need here right now. So let me go back to Mr. Robson. Mr. Robson, you did talk about that you were a professor that teaches equalization, and it's become so complex that you can't even teach it anymore because it doesn't make sense, if I can paraphrase what you said here. You did talk about the level of gamesmanship played by the different levels of government, and I presume that's the federal government and different governments that use certain input mechanisms to make sure they continue to profit from the system. And you said that that impacts the trust that Canadians feel with the system. Can you tell us what the impacts of citizens losing trust in the system has on a country?
Well, it's clear that one of the things that bothers people particularly is when they feel that they're being taken advantage of. And there's been a few references to that over the course of this conversation. When you look at the original structure of the equalization program.
That's that round. So closing off this round, we have Mr. Lavoie for 5 minutes.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. As you know, we are preparing our meetings like this morning. We prepare plenty of questions to ask, and sometimes it develops during the discussion. So for Mr. Bélan, I'd like to come back to equalization. So allow me to be the devil's advocate, and you'll see where I'm headed with this, and perhaps you can help me out. I've often seen in a former life, I was often a spectator of situations in which there were systems that had not evolved, that seemed no longer to be suitable to the reality of the day and to respond to the needs. And I also heard from the other witness who said that if you're going to do it, it should be simplified. It seems to be an attractive idea, first of all, to bring in some experts and change things. But often what I've seen, what I've realized and experienced is that often the new system creates new problems and does not solve the problem. It worsens it. So my question is, how can we have a maximum of guarantees, even though nothing can really be guaranteed, to do studies, to change things up? And how can we be sure it'll improve things? Do you think that there's some guarantees that we can bring in to have a group of experts to make changes, but to be sure that it will be better afterwards than it is now? So I'd like to give you the question and put that out there, and I'm happy to hear you. You're quite right to say that each change to equalization will necessarily bring a certain degree of controversy. We've seen that in 2006. If you recall Danny Williams, for example, in Newfoundland, who really revolted against the situation in Saskatchewan, the NDP government was not happy about some of the changes to equalization. I think that it's the mandate given to that group of experts has to be a broad mandate to really examine, not only to try out to switch around a few aspects on an incremental basis in the system, but really to look into all the possibilities based on what's written in the Constitution. So to make general proposals about different possibilities, maybe even above and beyond the current equalization system and changing the formula, but to say that we have here are some possibilities, 3 or 4 choices, maybe recommend one, and ultimately it will be up to the government and parliament to decide. But it has to be a transparent process. They have to take their time and really examine what is done in other countries. Sometimes we're a little bit too, how should I say it, or too provincial, to use a word like that. Perhaps in Canada it can be interpreted differently, but there are some places where things are done perhaps more efficiently or more transparently than in Canada, and we should look at the situation in Switzerland, in Australia, and so on, in order to have a real document accessible to all Canadians to really think it through from at an arm's length. And when we talk about money, obviously it's controversial. When I talk to you about guarantees, of course, one can never guarantee that, but often you open a Pandora's box. And you talked about the Constitution, but beyond that, what goal would you set up or what guideposts to make sure it would succeed? Because often if you open a Pandora's box, it can go in any direction and not necessarily better. What guidelines would you set or goals so that the process goes in the right direction? First of all, to avoid things because there's anxiety connected with, well, in the provinces that receive equalizations, and they don't want any provinces to be penalized by the new system. So, of course, it can cause restrictions for the experts in question, but can also reassure a lot of people because most of the provinces right now receive equalization. And if we start from that basis, we can also be very creative. A lot can be done, and the program can be improved without necessarily, I would say, causing anxiety attacks in some of the Canadian provinces. Any concrete ideas in conclusion in the last few seconds? I'd like to talk about taking into consideration the cost of services based on demographic factors, population aging, and population density in an equalization system, not only taking into account the fiscal capacity. Thank you very much.
Being here, we'll suspend for a few minutes to welcome the next witnesses. right, welcome back, everybody. We'll resume the meeting. I would like to welcome our witnesses. I'd like to remind participants of the following points. Just wait until you're recognized before, and wait for me to call your name before you speak. And a reminder that all comments should be addressed to the chair. To the witnesses, you'll have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will open the floor to questions. So we have department officials from the Department of Finance, so you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Good morning. My name is Galen Countryman. I am the Director General of the Federal Provincial Relations Division at Finance Canada. I'm joined today by my colleagues Tamala Rouge, Director General, Budget Policy and Government Operations, Nelson Patterson, Director General, Economic Studies and Policy Analysis, and Suzanne Kennedy, Senior Director, Equalization and Territorial Formula Financing Policy. La division responsable de l'administration et de la supervision de la quatre principales.
The division responsible for the administration and oversight of the 4 major transfer programs in Canada: the Canada Health Transfer, or CHT, the Canada Social Transfer, Equalization, and Territorial Formula Financing.
$108.3 billion. Together, the major transfers represent one of the largest expenditure envelopes in the federal budget. Ils sont conçus pour offrir un financement prévisible, stable.
They are designed to provide predictable, stable, and equitable funding across jurisdictions. The major transfers are largely unconditional. I will discuss the conditions when discussing the individual transfers.
Regarding how they decide to use the funds. The Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act and its regulations set out the specific methodologies, formulas, and data requirements for calculating the various payments under the major transfer programs. The Transfert canadien en matière de santé, ou TCS, assure un financement.
The Canada Health Transfer, or CHT, is the largest major federal transfer to provinces and territories. CHT is provided to provinces and territories on the condition that the national criteria and conditions specified in the Canada Health Act are satisfied. In 26-27, it will total $57.4 billion. Payments are made on an equal per capita basis. The CHT is guaranteed to grow at least 5% per year from 23-24 through 27-28. Beginning in 28-29, the CHT will revert to growing at a 3-year moving average of nominal GDP with a minimum growth rate of 3%. The Canada Social Transfer, or the CST, is the 3rd largest federal block transfer to provinces and territories and is intended to support 3 broad areas of social programs: post-secondary education, social assistance and social services, and early childhood development and early learning and child care.
Additional basis, with the exception of a minimum residency requirements and the provision of social assistance. In 2026-27, the CST will total $17.9 billion. Like the CHT is allocated on an equal per capita basis, and CST funding is legislated to grow by 3% annually. La péréquation est le programme de transfert du gouvernement du Canada qui traite.
Equalization is a Canadian government's transfer program for addressing fiscal disparities among provinces. The principle is to ensure that provincial governments have sufficient revenues to provide reasonably comparable levels of public services at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. In 2026-27, equalization payments will total $27.2 billion. 7 provinces will receive payments: Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and to a large part, the recommendation of the report of the 2006 expert panel on equalization and territorial formula financing. The overall equalization envelope grows each year based on a 3-year moving average of national nominal gross domestic product.
Transfer from the Government of Canada to the 3 territorial governments to enable them to provide their residents a range of public services comparable to those offered by provincial governments at comparable levels of taxation. In 2026-27, TFF will total $5.8 billion. The current formula is largely based on recommendations from the 2006 report on the expert panel of equalization and territorial formula financing. In addition to the major transfers, the division also administers the Fiscal Stabilization Program and statutory subsidies. The Fiscal Stabilization Program provides financial assistance to provinces that are facing significant year-over-year declines in their revenues resulting from extraordinary economic downturns. Statutory subsidies were provided as a result of how Canada developed as a federation. Most were legislated at the time of Confederation or when a province joined Canada. In 2026-27, they will total $45 million. As well, the federal government provides a range of transfers to provinces and territories to address specific issues. Ces transferts peuvent comporter des conditions et des exigences.
These transfers may include conditions and reporting requirements that are designed, administered, and overseen by the responsible line department. Examples include early learning and child care, labor market transfers, and the National School Food Program administered by ESDC.
So we'll start our first round, and we have Mr. McLean, 6 minutes.
Officials, welcome. Thank you for coming today. This goes to the heart of what we're talking about in the equalization problem we have in the country. And I say that because it is a problem. So let's look at the way you actually calculate equalization. You calculate equalization, as you said, reasonable levels of services at reasonable levels of taxation. So when you determine that formula, you go towards the median or the mean, as the case may be, and you determine that effectively one province that might have lower taxation gets obviously a larger economy. Now, this is the thing that happens here when you actually say a province with a higher level of taxation doesn't have as much of an economy and therefore doesn't have as much corporate or personal income tax revenue coming in to pay for their services, whereas the lower tax province actually has a higher labor force participation and a higher taxation revenue as a result. To erase that with an equalization system that says, okay, this would be the amount of taxes you pay if your economy, based on the economy that you are actually having at this point in time, this would be the amount of taxes you pay, and transfer that around as if you could just do that. The problem is if you had a higher level of taxation in those low tax provinces, you wouldn't have that much tax revenue. You wouldn't have that much economy. You wouldn't have that level of labor participation. Do you see the circular contradiction you're going through in even determining that formula that way?
I'll take a stab, and maybe Suzanne, if you want to add. So the equalization program, the calculation of fiscal capacity is based on a national average tax rates. So we tried to abstract away from individual taxation practices in provinces and territories, but we try to reflect what they do globally across the country. So each one is based on a national average tax rate based on a measure of their tax base. So
exactly my point. The national average tax rate. Okay, if you have a lower tax rate, you will have more economy. You don't adjust the reduction in your economy you would have if you actually moved that forward and said, okay, if this economy here that you're transferring funds from to other jurisdictions, if they had that higher tax rate, they would have less economy. So effectively what you're doing is penalizing the low tax provinces that have more economy and more taxation revenue as a result, and subsidizing the higher tax provinces and their economies because they won't make that adjustment. It's the Laffer curve. The more you tax, the less economy you have. And yet you're not adjusting for that all in your formulation.
I think what we're trying to reflect is what the actual taxation practices are across the country.
So you're not going to make any consideration for the fact that if you actually had a higher taxation revenue as an average when you're figuring out this formula, you would actually have lower tax revenues in those provinces you're applying that to. There's no consideration for that whatsoever.
There's no consideration for that in the formula that's currently there.
Do you think there should be?
We're basing on the formula, as I mentioned, is based on an expert panel that made recommendations in 2006.
2006, they made that expert panel. And was there anybody thinking about the economic destruction that would happen if you actually had a higher tax rate in the low tax provinces, how much you would penalize the economy in that scenario?
Sorry, I don't understand.
So are you penalizing the lower tax provinces because they have more economy as a result of having lower provincial taxes?
The equalization formula has been, there's been different formulations, but broadly speaking, has been based on national average tax rates since.
Okay, we all established the national average tax rate that you're talking about here. My question is very specific. If you had a higher tax rate in those low tax provinces, would you have as much tax revenue to spread around?
I don't know. I don't have the answer to that effectively.
Well, I do. The fact is, it's called, and you know it as well if you've done some economic studies. You would have lower tax revenue if you have higher taxes. This is proven in many economic studies. So the more you raise corporate taxes, the more you raise personal taxes, you reach a point where you're actually penalizing people and the economy is not expanding. What you're doing with this average formula is you're penalizing the lower tax provinces and saying, it doesn't matter how much lower you make your taxes, we're going to adjust it as if you have an average tax rate across the country, and we're going to spread that benefit around the country. Do you see what, you see the point? You see the actual frustration of actually growing an economy in some of the provinces in Canada and having to distribute that wealth to the provinces that aren't making that adjustment and aren't growing their economies.
Again, this is what the formula currently is. This is how it's been since 1957, broadly speaking.
Okay. So, I mean, I appreciate that you're stonewalling. The issue I'm asking again and again and again is if you're going to grow an economy, are you going to, so you take a high tax jurisdiction, and if they're going to lower their taxes to induce economic activity, and they see the result being they'll just get less transfers, do you think that that is something that slows them down from actually making the changes they need to make in their regional economies in order to grow the economy, grow their employment, and grow their fiscal revenue at those low tax levels, as opposed to just taking the money that the federal government's going to redistribute to them at the end anyways?
Well, I think that would be a question for a provincial government when they make the decisions as to whether higher economic growth and higher employment, as you say,
That's
time.
Lower tax. Next, we have Mr. Littell for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Okay, I think we said this before, but all federal transfer programs are a transfer of federal revenue. So there is one federal tax rate, which is the same across the country. The citizen in Quebec or the citizen in Alberta, if he has the same income, pays the same income tax to the federal government. So it's a transfer of federal revenues, not of provincial revenues. Now, we heard from the previous panel that the time might be it might be a good time now to perhaps rethink not just the way we calculate the current transfer formulas, but the elements that enter into that calculation. And one example that was mentioned, I think both Mr. Robson and Mr. Bélan were pointing in that direction, is that one of the fastest growing areas of spending, government spending in Canada, is healthcare, and that perhaps we have to devise a new way of assisting the provinces in providing sufficient financial resources, getting sufficient financial resources to provide reasonably equivalent services. Is there any kind of work being done at finance in rethinking how we should improve the federal transfer system, but particularly in what concerns healthcare?
Well, on healthcare, the main transfer program is the Canada Health Transfer. It is provided on an equal per capita basis. It is, let's say, to grow at 5% growth until 2027-28. After that grows at the GDP escalator. That's the current policy right now. I can't speak to whether the government will make any changes to that.
No, I understand, and that is the current policy right now. But other elements, like, for example, the different demographic makeup of different regions of the country, which would probably point to costs rising faster in some provinces than in other provinces. Should we try to capture that in in the new and improved formula, or that is something that will be coming to you from the political side, the politicians, the committee members, government would ask, okay, we'll do this, and then you would implement it. But my question was if you were already doing some work on how do we address this demographic, this widening demographic difference between East and West, for example.
Mr. Countryman, before you answer that, I pause the time. Is it possible for you to move the mic closer to you? I think some of the people on Zoom are having some difficulties hearing. Yeah, and the interpreter as well.
Okay, sorry about
that. Just speak, if you could speak just a little bit louder for the translators.
Sorry, I
Thank you.
realize. Thank you.
We'll continue the time.
So to respond to the question on healthcare, the Canada Health Transfer is currently allocated on an equal per capita basis, as you know. If you were to adopt a different allocation method within that and keep the same funding level, you would be you'd be changing the allocation. So some provinces would gain, some provinces would lose. But that's about all I could say right now. So
I understand, but for example, my colleague Jake, I'm sure he consumes less healthcare services than I do, just because of the fact he's a little younger than I am. But anyways, okay. Moving on from that, it was also mentioned that perhaps we should consider having an independent commission, independent body that would monitor the evolution of transfers, federal transfers, on an ongoing basis. Do you have a view on that?
I'm aware that Mr. Balaz has that view, and others have had that view. The transfers, as I mentioned, are all legislated, so everything about the 4 major transfers that we administer are set out in the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act down to the letter, so we just implement what Parliament has told us to do.
Yeah.
So the amounts are posted every year. Provinces, at least the officials, understand very well how those calculations are done. We share the calculation workbooks with the Library of Parliament and Parliamentary Budget Officer and any other academic who asks for them. Anyone, actually. They're available, and the historical data are all out there. So we even post the payments when they're made. They're all available on the finance website. So that's how we see it. I don't know, in terms of a commission, we had an expert panel in 2006 provide their views. So.
Okay, that was 20 years ago. Might be time to do another one now. But again, that will be up to us to make that decision. I understand. Just one final question, if I still have time. You also mentioned this, perhaps it's not very well known publicly, but there is also a federal fiscal stabilization payment. Perhaps in the time that we have left, if you could just talk a little bit about that.
You'll have to wait until your next round.
Okay.
Next, we have Mr. Garon for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. And welcome to the witnesses from the Department of Finance. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Countryman, I'd like you to confirm to me that the Canadian Equalization Program is a spending program from the Consolidated Federal Fund.
Comes out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund? The answer is yes.
Merci. J'aimerais savoir.
Thank you. I'd like to know whether you're aware of roughly what proportion of the federal revenues come from Quebec taxpayers.
Je n'ai pas cette information avec moi.
I do not have that information with me. Let's just suppose, hypothetically, for the purposes of the discussion, let's suppose that 20% of the federal revenue comes from individuals and companies located in Quebec. In that case, that would mean that 20% of the equalization payments received by Quebec are paid for by Quebecers. Do you agree with that? We use the general government revenues for equalization, so we receive revenues from across the entire country. Excellent. So that would mean, for example, that if 18% of the federal government's revenues came from Alberta, or 20%, that 80% of the equalization payments paid to Quebec are from provinces other than Alberta, and perhaps from some provinces that that receive equalization. Does that stand up? It's just that we spend toward the provinces and at the federal level. So basically, Chair, what I'm trying to express here is that I believe today you have 7 provinces that receive equalization, and equalization is paid from the Consolidated Revenue Fund of the federal government, and all the provinces and territories contribute to it. So that means that not only do Quebecers pay 20% of their own equalization, but that essentially the vast majority of the equalization payments received by those provinces that receive it are in fact paid for by those provinces that receive it. I'm just trying to express that. I'd like to know, Mr. Countryman, if at the Department of Finance, if you have a list of all the programs of transfers, fiscal expenditures, tax credits for individuals, and for the provincial governments that operate in fields of exclusively provincial jurisdiction or shared jurisdiction. Do you have a list of all the programs of the federal government which act in fields of provincial jurisdiction? And if that is the case, would it be possible to provide it in writing to the committee? If not, would it be possible to put together such a list? We do not have such a list. So would it be possible for the Department of Finance to prepare us such a list and send it to the committee, please? It depends, because it's a question of jurisdiction, that is shared jurisdiction. That's fine. Could you include both provincial and shared jurisdiction? And we'll do a follow-up with the clerk to find out if it's possible to do so. And I'll also talk to the finance department about that. And I would like to ask you to confirm that the Canada Health transfer to the provinces in a field of exclusively provincial jurisdiction, I'd like you to confirm that it has strings attached under the Canada Health Act. So the Canada Health transfer is to respect the provinces, they respect the conditions. Excellent. So the federal government imposes conditions in a field of jurisdiction which they do not have a constitutional right to legislate. I'd like you to confirm to me that the Canada social transfer includes conditions also for the provinces in their own fields of jurisdiction. The only condition for the CST, Canada Social Transfer.
Donc pour l'aide sociale.
So for social assistance, I understand it's for social aid. So in a field that is exclusively provincial, to receive the transfer, they have to qualify for conditions imposed by the federal government. I would like to know whether you think it is proper and desirable for the federal government, in exchange for transfers or for amounts of funding, that it requires the provinces to report to it and provide performance reports in fields of jurisdiction in which the federal government, constitutionally speaking, has no right to legislate. I'd like to know whether you believe that it is appropriate or desirable or proper.
All I can speak to there is that under the 4 transfers that we administered, I spoke to, there's no requirement for provinces to report back to the federal government. They are.
Donc vous considérez que des conditions sur les transferts.
So you consider that the transfer requirements are not an obligation to report.
Transfers, and provinces and territories are not required to report back on how they spend those funds.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
That's time.
Thank you, Chair.
Next 5-minute round, we have Ms. Kabina.
Thank you, Chair. My questions, I believe the right person is Mr. LaRouche. They're around your calculations. Has your department created a cost projection for the government's announced sovereign wealth fund?
Thank you for the question. Well, the announcement, of course, you are referring to what was in the update and announced by the Prime Minister a few days before, the Canada Strong Fund. That's I do high-level projections. I don't have the specific detail on that measure, aside from what was disclosed in the update. So I think we have a panel here to talk about general projections and fiscal situation and things like that. Specific questions on the Canada Strong Fund, I think we would have to refer to colleagues and get back to you on that.
Okay.
So,
yeah, and just to be clear, the fund was not included in the spring economic update, which was actually shocking because it is going to borrow $25 billion to seed the fund. But just to be clear, you don't have costing for the debt that will be taken out, and you don't have costing even for the infrastructure that will be needed to establish the fund.
No, I don't think that. Sorry, Mr. Chair, if I may, we do have some details in the update. I mean, there's going to be a transition office. I mean, work is of course underway on this fund. I believe we have the detail. Sorry, I
so
could
just
find
the
it.
costing.
It's not. I mean, it's fairly minimal, but there is going to be a cost for the transition office.
Do you have that cost available?
Yeah, sure.
The reason why I'm asking, of course, is because there hasn't been too much detail given to the broader public, even though the broader public is being asked to invest in it. But when I asked the Bank of Canada governor, he had not been consulted, does not have the cost, and he directed me to the finance department, which is you.
That's right. So, Mr. Chair, just to answer the previous question on the cost of the transition office, so they are about $6 million over 6 years. So starting this fiscal year, so so the details are provided in page 86.
Yeah, but that's just a transition office.
That's
Sorry,
correct,
I'm
that's
asking
correct,
about
yes.
the fund itself.
Well, the fund itself.
The debt and the infrastructure needed to establish it.
Correct. So, I mean, some assumptions are made in terms of the cash requirements. I mean, the government has been pretty transparent that they are going to support this fund initially. Some assumption, I don't think we're very explicit in the assumptions, but I can say that there's an assumption that is made in terms of the financial requirements, and it's factored in our projection for public debt
answer it in
charges.
terms of dollars?
Yes.
How much is it going to cost?
I don't think we are explicit in the document around like the profiling, but we do factor in, obviously, we make an assumption in terms of financial requirements and public debt charges.
Okay,
Yeah.
so do you have the number?
I don't have the number with me today, but
Okay. Could you
I
submit
can
the
endeavor
number
to,
then?
yes.
Just to have the cost, of course, of the debt itself, but also just establish it.
Right. So I will consult with colleagues and we'll get back to you as a follow-up, and I think we have a transcript, and we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll follow up on this.
And of course, the reason why I'm also asking is because Canada does have a number of investment crown corporations, namely the Business Development Bank of Canada, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, the Sustainable Development Technology Canada. So, we're trying to understand why there is a need for another debt-funded crown corporation, and what is the sovereign wealth fund going to do that the other crown corporations don't already do?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's a fair observation. There are a number of funds, and the Canada Growth Fund is another one. I mean, this one is a little bit different. As I mentioned, I mean, we have high-level details in the update. Work is underway currently. It's not really my area of expertise, so I will not, pronounce or make, provide details there. But we can endeavor to get back to you with as much details as we have at this moment.
And just very high level, why is this fund needed? What is the gap that the other crown corporations have created, the things that they do not do that the fund will do?
Again, this is not my area, so I wouldn't be able to.
That's time. We'll going on to the next 5-minute round. Mr. McDonald.
Actually, I'm going to cede to Mr. Turnbull. I just want to take up this conversation that Ms. Kobina started here. I know, like, the Canada Growth Fund uses some public investment as its sort of seed funding for the pool of capital, and it's drawing in private capital, but it's on concessionary terms. I think it's explicit in the documents that that it's a concessionary financing. It's, I think, mostly equity, but there's some debt financing in there. The Canada Infrastructure Bank is different as well. Concessionary loans, correct? And so my understanding of the Sovereign Wealth Fund is that it's going to be on commercial terms and it's equity. So it's a different tool in the toolbox that that is unique in kind, and it allows, just as the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program allows or enables First Nations and Indigenous communities to participate in owning equity in major projects, this particular Sovereign Wealth Fund would allow, on commercial terms, the same for everyday Canadians who would be able to invest in it. Mr. LaRoche, can you just correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe confirm what I've just outlined as the intention behind the Sovereign Wealth Fund? Because I think that's been explicit in our documents.
I mean, thank you. Just again, I don't have. I mean, it's not my area, so I don't have all the. I couldn't really confirm. But I mean, it is true that these funds have different purposes. What I can endeavor to do is, we can get back to you in writing with as much detail as we can provide as a follow-up.
Thank you very much for that. I'll pass it back to my colleague, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you. Just quickly, the Canada Health transfer, it's a conditional transfer of funds. So can you just explain quickly the difference between the transfers that your department handles? Some of them are conditional on the provinces, some of them are with no conditions attached.
So thank you for the question. So equalization is just completely unconditional. Territorial formula financing, completely unconditional. Canada Health transfer, that is to uphold the principles of the Canada Health Act. And for the Canada Social Transfer, the legislation requires that provinces and territories have no minimum residency requirements in the delivery of social assistance.
So is it fair to say provinces that are challenged with higher costs of providing health care, so the formula provides 5% up to 2028, I believe. Jurisdiction I'm from, Prince Edward Island, they're claiming their costs are going up 14% a year. There's no balancing act there, but they can use those equalization funds to balance that out, right? That's the way it's designed.
So the purpose of equalization is to allow provinces to provide comparable levels of services at reasonably comparable levels of taxation.
And is there any way of catching, in particular, we're in a world today, the reality is that we have a migratory workforce. So especially regions like Atlantic Canada, we have a lot of workers that will go to a province like Alberta, stay there for their productive years, pay tax, increase the balance sheet in Alberta, but return to Atlantic Canada for their retirement, which puts strains on our healthcare system. There's nothing in today's formula that addresses that, is there? Other than the equalization part of the transfers.
Again, the transfers are annual transfers, annual calculations, so there's nothing sort of like that lifetime perspective that you're speaking about.
And in terms of just total economic, I mean, these transfers were designed so that all regions would have equal access to not only healthcare and social services, but also infrastructure. So it's important that smaller regions have ports, roads, airports, the whole gamut of things. And we heard earlier that the current formula dates back to 2006. Now, I know it's hard for you to express an opinion because I heard your answer earlier, but I'm going to put you on the spot again. Do you think it's time to revisit that and look at creating a panel of expert witnesses to come up with an improved formula going forward?
You'll have to answer that in another round. That's time. Next, we have Mr. Garon for 2.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Countryman, could you tell me what is the rate of increase, the nominal increase rate of the Canada Health transfer for the coming 3 years?
Which, Monsieur Caron? Excuse.
Monsieur le Président, appel au règlement, c'est possible.
Chair, a point of order, if possible. What happened previously, I would like to make you aware of this. There are certain issues of interpretation. It takes a lot of time. This is an example where we have 25 seconds. It's almost 20% of my question round. Would you allow me to start over again in order not to lose that time, please?
Juste un moment.
Just a moment, sir. We're dealing with a point of order.
Donc, on recommencerait maintenant. Je vais reposer la question.
So let me start again. I'll ask the question again to make sure it's understood well by the witness. Is that all right? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So, what I was asking you, Mr. Countryman, I'd like you to tell me, for the next 3 years, as budgeted as of now, what will be the nominal increase rate of the Canada Health transfer? I don't necessarily have the rate in front of me, but the rate between 26-27 is 5% for the CHT, and is again 5% after that, and then after that it's the nominal growth rate of the GDP. So probably a bit below 5. So are you aware in the department of the growth rate in the health system costs on average in Quebec? I don't have the numbers of the Quebec health growth at the moment. According to various calculations, including academics and in the HEC Montreal, with 5 major criteria, set it at more than 6%. So supposing that the system costs increase by about 6%, would you be of the opinion that 5% next year, 5% the following year, and so on, the nominal GDP, that those increased rates could constitute gradual withdrawal of the federal government from financing of health? With those growth rates, the CHT will continue to increase foreseeably for the provinces and territories. Yes, foreseeable, but lower than the growth of the system costs. I'd like to get your opinion. I know that you might not be in a position to give it to me, but I'd like to know if you think that Quebecers and Canadians as a whole are sufficiently well informed or know well about the fields of jurisdiction of the federal government and which are the provincial fields of jurisdiction. Do you think that the average Canadian understands the fields of jurisdiction of the respective levels of government? I don't know the level of knowledge of the average Canadians on federal and provincial jurisdiction. You don't want to make the risk of making a hypothesis?
Thank you. On the we've had some talk today in this study about the lack of transparency and the lack of understanding about how transfers within the Federation work. Recipients of equalization is relatively straightforward. It's reported in the public accounts. You can tell quite easily how much a province has received. For example, in 2025, Quebec, I think the number was 13 billion as a recipient, the largest single provincial recipient, not the largest per capita, but the largest overall. How does one assess, or where can one find the precise number of how much a province has paid into equalization. So the formula determines how much is paid directly to a province under the Fiscal Arrangements Act, but the public accounts is not as clear on how much money was extracted from a province under this formula. So could you tell, for example, could you tell the committee right now what Alberta paid in 24-25, the last fiscal year for which we have the public accounts?
As I think we've discussed before, the equalization is funded out of federal revenues in general, so it's of the Consolidated Revenue Fund.
I understand, but you have a formula that dictates how much each province receives. So, at which you can buy each. You could look it up individually, but you cannot similarly see where it comes from. So, could you give us the number for Alberta? You have provinces that are non-recipients of this, but you have provinces that do receive, and it's all subject to a formula. So could you explain for the committee and for Canadians how much the provinces, not just Alberta, let's say the provinces that are not net recipients, not recipients of the fund?
So again, all Canadian businesses pay into the Consolidated Revenue Fund for various sources of taxation and other revenues. The federal government receives, it goes in the Consolidated Revenue Fund, and then the government of Canada decides to spend on various programs out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund.
I
one
understand.
of which is equalization.
The federal government taxes Canadians in all provinces, and then they only pay out to some under a formula. So the net amount that went to the other 7 provinces necessarily came from the other 3. I mean, this is how equalization works. That's the equal part of equalization. Can you give us a number for the other provinces?
But, taxes are collected from every province into the Consolidated Revenue Fund, and then there's payments out.
But it is done by formula. So this is exactly what I think Mr. Robson and other witnesses today, when they talked about how opaque the system of fiscal transfers really are, when you have some provinces that are net contributors and others that are net recipients through the program of equalization. Sorry,
Again, the only other place you could look, sir, is like Stats Canada puts out, provincial economic accounts. It shows where federal revenues and spending go by province.
Perhaps you could table a response. I would like right now, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, I'm going to take this moment to ask permission from the committee to move a motion that was not quite on with enough notice, but I think there's been discussions between the parties, and so I am going to seek the committee's permission to quickly move a motion.
We have unanimous consent for Mr. Kelly to move a motion.
Certainly, Liberals are comfortable with giving unanimous consent for this, and I think our Bloc colleague was amenable as well.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Thank you, committee members. So with that, I move that the committee undertake a study of Bill C-30, an act to implement certain provisions of the Spring Economic Update tabled in Parliament on April 28th, 2026, provided that A, the following witnesses be invited to appear separately for no less than 1 hour each: the Minister of Finance and National Revenue, the Minister of Jobs and Families in relation to the proposed amendments to the Employment Insurance Act, 3, the Minister of Transport in relation to the proposed amendments to the Canada Transportation Act, 4, the Governor of the Bank of Canada in relation to the proposed amendments to the Bank of Canada Act, B, the Minister of Health and the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food be invited to appear for 1 hour on the same panel related to the proposed amendments to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency Act and the Pest Control Products Act. C, the committee receive 4 hours of additional witness testimony, including at least one panel with departmental officials for a technical briefing, a panel of Canadians affected by high fuel, grocery and housing prices, another panel impacted by the annual alcohol excise duty inflation adjustment, and another panel featuring witnesses deemed relevant by members of the committee. And D, the chair only be authorized to schedule a meeting for the purpose of clause-by-clause consideration of the bill after the witnesses have appeared as prescribed in this motion. This was on notice, but only briefly. Mr. Turnbull?
So yes, thanks, Chair, and thanks to my colleague, Mr. Kelly, for bringing this forward and moving this today. I think this is a quite reasonable proposal and is a good example of, I think, the committee coming together to work collaboratively, although we'll have different views on different aspects of this particular implementation act for the Spring Economic Update. I think it's a good proposal. The only issue that I have with it is part 4. So the Governor of the Bank of Canada ultimately, I think, will be hard pressed to comment on legislative changes that are ultimately in the purview of the Minister of Finance, which is amendments to the Bank of Canada Act. We've seen the Bank of Canada Governor just recently. He did a great job at committee. I'm sure we all agree that it's great to have him as frequently as possible. But I don't think in this case that that's necessary. I think with the Minister of Finance and National Revenue coming, which is your first ask for 1 hour, that he was more than capable of speaking to the Bank of Canada Act amendments that he is ultimately accountable for, and that our government should answer for, right, and should have a good answers to your questions. So I would just propose an amendment, what I would consider a friendly amendment, which is to remove 4 out of that. So just delete that line, and then I think we're prepared to support it. And I think other parties may be as well, but I won't speak for Mr. Garon because he's more than capable of speaking for himself.
Mr. Garon?
Well, I also agree with the other parties to agree with this motion on principle. I think we've already had notice of Ways and Means, and we have to rapidly undertake a study of Bill C-30. I think it's quite appropriate to receive most of the witnesses on the motion before we go through the clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-30, and the ministers will be welcome as well as the senior officials. I would like also, well, I wonder about the fact of inviting the Bank of Canada on a legislative change that has to do with the Bank of Canada. There's a certain independence between the legislative and the executive that is not perfect, and the judiciary, but the central bank, I doubt that it's inclined to discuss legislative changes. Perhaps if our Conservative colleagues could speak to that, but I hesitate as regards that witness, and also inviting the Bank of Canada would reduce the amount of precious time available to perhaps question other witnesses that might be able to enable us to make better decisions and make the best possible amendments to Bill C-30.
Maybe I can just ask, is it the will of the committee to unanimously pass the friendly amendment by Mr. Turnbull? Okay.
Yes.
So we'll move on to the, as amended. Is it the will of the committee to pass the motion? Okay. Thank you, colleagues. And is it the will of the committee to adjourn? Yes. Yeah? Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, witnesses.